The gavel had not yet fallen when Jane Conley rose from her chair, smoothed the black wool of her mourning dress, and said the words that would follow her through the rest of her days. "I've got no family left to speak for me," she said, her voice steady though her hands were not, and the land office in Prairie Bend, Kansas, went quiet enough to hear the wind rattling the shutters outside. It was the spring of 1878, and the room smelled of tallow candles and cold coffee and the particular dust that settled over every surface west of the Missouri River. Behind the long pine counter sat the county land agent, a narrow man named Elias Prout, who wore his spectacles low on his nose and his loyalties even lower. And beside him, leaning against the wall with his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets, stood Hollis Dunbar, the cattle baron who owned more of Ford County than any three men combined and wanted still more. Jane Conley was 26 years old, and in the 3 years since she had come west with her husband Thomas, she had buried more than most women bury in a lifetime. Her mother and father had died of the cholera back in Independence, Missouri, before she had even left home. Her only brother had gone off to the war in '63 and never come back, not even his body, just a letter from a stranger saying he died at a place called Chickamauga. And 6 months passed. Thomas Conley had been thrown from a Greenbrook gelding and had struck his head against a fence post, and he had died 3 days later without ever opening his eyes again. That left her alone on 160 acres of prairie sod that Thomas had claimed under the Homestead Act, land they had broken together with a borrowed plow, land where she had planted the cottonwood saplings that now stood taller than the sod house they'd built with their own hands. She had come to town that morning to file the proof of claim that would finally turn 5 years of sweat and grief into a patent with her name on it, a piece of paper that said the land was hers, truly hers forever. Hollis Dunbar had other ideas. "Now see here, Prout," Dunbar said, and his voice carried the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life doubted that things would go his way. "The law is plain. A homestead claim requires proof of continuous residence and improvement for the full term, filed by the claimant. Thomas Conley is dead. He didn't finish his term. And this woman," he gestured at Jane as though she were a piece of furniture he was appraising, "this woman has no standing to file in his stead. She's got no husband, no father, no brother to vouch that the claim was honestly worked. For all this office knows, she's a fraud looking to steal land out from under a legitimate buyer." "I am no fraud, Mr. Dunbar," Jane said, and there was iron beneath the tremor in her voice. "I broke that sod with my own 2 hands right alongside my husband. I planted every row of corn we ever harvested. I nursed him 3 days before he died, and I have not left that claim a single night since we built it." "That may well be true, ma'am," Prout said, not quite meeting her eyes, "but the law requires witnesses. 2 disinterested men who can swear to your residency and character before this office. Without that, I cannot process the patent, and Mr. Dunbar's offer to purchase the relinquished claim will stand by default in 30 days' time." "Relinquished," Jane repeated, and the word tasted like ash. "I have not relinquished anything." "The law don't care much for what a body intends, ma'am," Dunbar said, and there was no cruelty in his tone, only the flat certainty of a man reciting arithmetic. "It cares what's proven." It was then that Jane Conley had said it, the words that would echo through the rest of her life. "I've got no family left to speak for me." She said it not as an excuse but as a fact laid bare on the counter between them, the way a man might lay down his last coin in a game he already knew he'd lost. And it was then that a voice came from the back of the room, from near the door where a tall man had been standing so quietly that most had forgotten he was there at all. "I'll speak for her." Every head turned. The man who stepped forward was perhaps 30 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who had spent years wrestling cattle and breaking horses, with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of a creek in autumn, gray-green and clear. He wore a battered gray hat, a canvas coat gone soft with wear, and spurs that jingled once as he crossed the plank floor. Jane did not know him. She had seen him perhaps twice in town, at a distance, and had heard his name spoken with respect by the storekeeper's wife, but she had never spoken to him herself. "And who in blazes are you?" Dunbar asked, though the irritation in his voice suggested he already suspected the answer would not please him. "Raymond Wilcox," the man said. "I run the Wilcox spread out past Sundown Creek, 6 miles north of the Conley claim. I knew Thomas Conley for 3 years. I helped him raise that sod house with my own hands the spring after they came out from Missouri. I've ridden past that homestead more times than I could count, and I have seen Jane Conley in that field at first light and at last light, working that ground like it was the only thing keeping her breathing. I'll swear to her residency before God and this office both, and I reckon I can find a second man before sundown who'll do the same." Jane turned to look at him fully then, and something in her chest, some tight and frightened thing that had been clenched since the morning Thomas had died, loosened just a fraction. She did not know this man, but she had heard his name, and there was something in the set of his jaw, in the plain steadiness of his voice, that made her believe him. "That's a mighty generous offer, Mr. Wilcox," Prout said, clearly uncomfortable now that the tide of the room had shifted. "But the law does require 2 witnesses, sworn and disinterested." "Then I'll bring you 2, Raymond said. "Give me until Friday." Dunbar's mouth twisted into something that was not quite a smile. "Friday, then. Though I'd wager a fair sum this office won't see hide nor hair of a second witness by then." He settled his hat lower on his brow and walked out into the street, his boot heels striking the boards like the ticking of some patient clock counting down toward her ruin. Jane stood very still for a long moment after the door had swung shut behind him, and then she turned to Raymond Wilcox, and for the first time in 6 months, tears she had not allowed herself to shed in front of another living soul rose hot and sudden in her eyes. "Mr. Wilcox, I don't know why you trouble yourself over a woman you've barely met," she said, her voice cracking despite her best effort to hold it steady. "I knew your husband," Raymond said simply. "He was a good man, and he loved that land, and he loved you, ma'am, more than I ever heard a man speak of his wife. It would sit poorly with me to let Hollis Dunbar take it from you on account of a technicality and a dead man's bad luck. Besides," he paused, and something almost shy crossed his weathered face, "it ain't right, a body having no one to speak for them. Every soul deserves at least one person willing to stand up and say they're worth believing." Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of turned earth and distant rain, and Jane Conley wiped her eyes with the back of her glove and found herself, for the first time since Thomas's death, looking forward to what the next few days might bring. They walked out of the land office together into the wide, dusty street of Prairie Bend, past the mercantile with its barrels of flour stacked in the window, past the saloon where a piano was already limping through an afternoon tune, past the livery where a boy no older than 14 was mucking out stalls and whistling off-key. Raymond had tied his horse, a rangy bay gelding named Duster, at the rail outside, and he untied him now with the unhurried care of a man who did everything without waste of motion. "I've got my wagon around back," Jane said. "I ought to be getting on home before the light goes. It's near 6 miles. "I know the way," Raymond said. "I'll ride along if you'll allow it. Not safe for a woman alone on that road these days, not with Dunbar's men riding it so free." She wanted to protest that she had ridden that road alone 100 times since Thomas died, that she was not some fragile thing to be escorted like a piece of china, but there was something in the plain courtesy of his offer that disarmed her, and besides, the thought of 6 miles of solitary road with the sun already westering did not appeal to her half so much as it once might have. "I'd be obliged," she said. They rode together out of town, her wagon creaking over the ruts, his horse keeping an easy pace alongside, and for a long while neither of them spoke. The prairie unrolled around them in every direction, grass gone gold-green with the spring rains, meadowlarks calling from fence posts, and far off to the west a line of clouds building dark and heavy over the horizon. "You said you knew Thomas," Jane said at last. "How well?" Well enough, Raymond said. We hunted together a time or two. He borrowed my ox team the first year he was breaking that sod before he could afford his own. Good worker. Talked about you something fierce, ma'am, if you don't mind my saying. Used to tell me you could outshoot half the men in the county and bake a pie sweeter than any woman in 3 states, though I expect that last part might have been a husband's exaggeration. A small, surprised laugh escaped her, the first laugh she had allowed herself in what felt like a very long time. He did love his exaggerations, but I can shoot. My father taught me before we ever left Missouri. I don't doubt it, Raymond said, and there was warmth in his voice now, an easiness that had not been there in the land office, where his jaw had been set hard with purpose. A woman alone on the prairie ought to know how to handle a rifle. World's not always kind to those who can't defend what's theirs. No, Jane agreed quietly. It is not. They rode on, and she found herself studying him from the corner of her eye, the strong line of his hands on the reins, the way he sat his horse like he'd been born to it, the faint scar above his left eyebrow that spoke of some old mishap he had not yet explained. There was a stillness to him, a quiet confidence that reminded her, in some way she could not quite name, of the calm she had once felt in her father's presence, back before the fever took him, back before the whole world had begun taking things from her one by one. "Why do you live alone, Mr. Wilcox?" asked, and then immediately regretted the boldness of the question. "Forgive me, that was forward. No harm in it," he said, and if the question troubled him, he did not show it. "I had a wife once, back in Missouri before I came west. Sarah her name was. We were married 2 years. She took sick with the fever the same winter my folks passed, and I lost all 3 of them inside of a month. Wasn't much reason to stay after that, so I came out here, bought this spread, and built it up on my own. Been alone going on 6 years now." "I'm sorry," Jane said, and she meant it deeply, felt the weight of his loss settle alongside her own like 2 stones dropped into the same still pond. "It seems this country asks a terrible price of those who come to tame it." "It does," Raymond agreed. "But it gives back, too, sometimes, if a body's patient enough to wait for it." They said little more the rest of the way, but the silence between them had changed its character, had become companionable rather than merely polite, and when they crested the last rise in Jane's little sod house came into view, low and brown against the darkening sky, with its 2 cottonwood saplings standing sentinel on either side of the door, Raymond drew rein and looked out over the fields with an expression of quiet appreciation. "You've done fine work here," he said. "Thomas would be proud." "I hope so," Jane said, and found that her throat had tightened again, though this time not entirely from grief. Raymond helped her unhitch the wagon team, working alongside her without being asked, and when the horses were fed and watered and the sun had sunk to a thin red line along the western edge of the world, he mounted Duster and touched his hat brim. "I'll come by Wednesday," he said. "I know a man, name of Silas Amos, keeps a small spread south of here, honest as they come. He'll stand as second witness if I ask him proper. Between the 2 of us, we'll have your patent filed by Friday, and Holly's Dunbar can go find some other widow's land to covet." "Thank you, Mr. Wilcox," Jane said. "I don't know how I'll ever repay such kindness." "You don't owe me nothing, ma'am," Raymond said. "Just keep breaking that ground the way you have been. That's payment enough for a man who likes to see justice done." He rode off into the gathering dusk, and Jane Conley stood in her doorway and watched him go until he was nothing but a shape against the darkening plain, and something in her chest that had been frozen since the morning Thomas died stirred faintly, like the first green shoot pushing up through the last hard crust of winter ground. The days that followed passed in a blur of preparation. Raymond was true to his word, and on Wednesday he arrived at Jane's homestead with Silas Amos riding beside him, a stooped, gray-bearded man with kind eyes and a slow way of speaking that put Jane immediately at ease. Silas walked the fields with her, examined the sod house, admired the corn already knee-high in the June sun, and pronounced himself entirely satisfied that Jane Conley had worked that claim as honestly as any man or woman in the territory. "I'll swear to it before God and the devil both," Silas said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt for emphasis. "Dunbar's got no more right to this land than I've got to fly. Man's greed has finally outrun his sense, if he thinks he can steal a widow's homestead right out from under her nose." But Hollis Dunbar was not a man accustomed to losing, and as the days wore on toward Friday, it became clear that he did not intend to accept defeat gracefully. It began with small things. A fence Jane had mended the week before was found torn down again, the posts pulled clean out of the ground. Her well rope was cut, left dangling uselessly into the dark water below. Then, on Thursday night, as a storm rolled through with lightning cracking the sky into jagged pieces, Jane woke to the acrid smell of smoke and ran outside to find her small hay barn engulfed in flame, the fire licking hungrily up through the dry timber, despite the rain that had begun to fall. She screamed for help, though there was no one to hear her, and she ran with buckets to the well, hauling water up hand over hand with a rope she had hastily knotted back together, throwing it uselessly against a blaze too large for one woman to fight alone. The rain thickened, and for a terrible while it seemed the whole night sky had turned to fire and water at once, and Jane wept even as she worked, cursing Hollis Dunbar's name into the storm, mourning the loss of the winter's hay, of the small shelter Thomas had built for their 2 milk cows, of one more piece of the life she had fought so hard to keep. It was Raymond who found her there an hour later, having ridden out through the storm on some instinct he could not entirely explain, some restless worry that had pulled him from his bed and sent him galloping the 6 miles between his spread and hers, with his slicker flying behind him like a dark wing. He found her soaked to the bone, her hands blistered from the bucket rope, standing in the mud watching the last embers of her barn hiss and smoke in the rain, and something in him broke open at the sight of her, small and fierce and utterly alone against a world that seemed determined to take everything from her. "Jane," he said, dismounting before Duster had even fully stopped, and it was the first time he had used her Christian name, and neither of them seemed to notice the shift, so natural did it feel. "Jane, are you hurt?" "My cows," she said, her voice hollow with exhaustion and grief. "I got them out, thank God, but the barn, all our hay, Raymond, all of it." "I know," he said, and he took her by the shoulders, gently, the way a man might handle something precious and easily broken. "I know, but you're alive and your cows are safe and that barn can be rebuilt. Hay can be bought or borrowed. You cannot be replaced." She looked up at him then, rain streaming down both their faces, lightning still flickering pale and distant on the horizon, and something passed between them that neither had words for yet, some recognition too large and too sudden to be named. "This was Dunbar," she said. "I know it was. Who else would want to see me ruined?" "I believe you," Raymond said, and his jaw hardened in a way she had not seen since the land office. "And I intend to see he answers for it. But not tonight. Tonight you need dry clothes and a warm fire, and I mean to see you get both." He would not leave her alone that night, though he was careful, scrupulously careful, to conduct himself with all the propriety the situation demanded. He built up the fire in her small hearth, brewed coffee from the little tin she kept on the shelf, and sat in a hard wooden chair by her door until dawn, keeping watch, while Jane slept fitfully on her narrow bed, exhausted past dreaming. In the gray light of morning, he rode into town and found Sheriff Amos Pratt, a heavy-set man with a walrus mustache and a reputation for fairness that even Hollis Dunbar's money had not entirely managed to erode, and he told him what had happened. And though there was no proof, no witness, nothing but the smell of coal oil that Raymond swore he'd caught on the wind near the ruined barn, the sheriff promised to look into it. And more than that, he promised to be present at Friday's hearing at the land office, to see that the proceedings were conducted fairly. Friday came bright and clear, as though the storm 2 nights before had scoured the whole sky clean, and Jane Conley walked into the Prairie Bend land office with her chin high, wearing her one good dress, a dove-gray calico that had been her Sunday best in the years when Thomas was still alive to see her wear it. And on either side of her walked Raymond Wilcox and Silas Amos, both dressed in their finest, both grave and solemn as churchmen. Hollis Dunbar was already there, seated in a chair near the counter with his boots crossed at the ankle, an expression of lazy confidence on his face that faltered only slightly when he saw the three of them enter together. "Well now," he said. "Seems the widow found her witnesses after all." "Seems she did," Sheriff Pratt said, stepping in from the doorway behind them, his badge catching the morning light. "And seeing as I've an interest in how this county's land gets divided up fair and square, I thought I'd sit in on the proceedings myself, if nobody objects." Nobody objected, though Elias Pruitt's hands trembled slightly as he shuffled his papers, and Hollis Dunbar's smile grew a shade tighter around the edges. Raymond stepped forward first and swore his oath, his voice ringing clear and steady through the small room as he testified to 3 years of acquaintance with Thomas and Jane Conley, to the sod house he had helped raise, to the fields he had watched Jane break and plant and harvest with her own hands, season after season, without ever once abandoning the claim for so much as a single night. Then Silas Amos gave his testimony, quieter but no less certain, describing his own visits to the homestead, the corn he had seen growing tall and green, the evident and continuous labor that spoke to any honest observer of a claim worked in good faith. "There," Pruitt said, when both men had finished, his voice betraying something almost like relief. "That satisfies the witness requirement. I see no legal impediment to processing Mrs. Conley's proof of claim and forwarding it to the General Land Office for patent." "Now hold on," Dunbar said, rising from his chair, and for the first time Jane saw something like genuine anger flash across his composed features. "This is a formality being twisted to suit sentiment rather than law. The claim was made by Thomas Conley, not by his widow. The law says a widow may complete the residency and cultivation requirements of her deceased husband's claim and receive patent in her own name, provided proof is furnished," Sheriff Pratt interrupted, and he produced from inside his coat a folded pamphlet, worn soft with handling, which he laid upon the counter with the deliberate care of a man playing a winning card. "I took the liberty of writing to the land office in Topeka this week, Mr. Dunbar, on account of some concerns raised to me about the fairness of these proceedings. This here is a copy of the relevant statute, plain as day. Widows have completed claims this way all across the territory since the war. There ain't a thing irregular about it, provided the residency's proven, which these two gentlemen have just done." The silence that followed was the sweetest sound Jane had ever heard. Hollis Dunbar's face went through several shades of red before settling into something pale and furious, and he looked from the sheriff to Pruitt to Jane herself with an expression that promised this was not the last she would hear from him, though for now, in this room on this morning, the law stood plainly on her side. "This isn't finished," Dunbar said, low and cold, gathering his hat from the counter. "I believe it is, Mr. Dunbar," Sheriff Pratt said mildly. "Unless you'd care to discuss with me the matter of a certain barn that burned 2 nights past, in whether I'm told smelled peculiarly of coal oil for all the rain that was falling." Dunbar said nothing further. He simply settled his hat upon his head, cast one last venomous glance around the room, and walked out into the street without another word. And Jane Conley felt the weight of 6 months' fear and grief lift from her shoulders all at once, so suddenly and so completely that her knees very nearly gave way beneath her. Raymond caught her elbow before she could stumble, steadying her with a strength that felt in that moment like the only solid thing in a world gone briefly dizzy with relief. "It's done," he said softly, close to her ear. "Jane, it's done. The land is yours." "Because of you," she said, turning to look up at him, her eyes bright with tears she no longer bothered to hide. "Raymond, I have no way to thank you for what you've done." "You don't owe me thanks," he said, though his voice had gone rough with some emotion he seemed to be working hard to contain. "I told you once already, ma'am. Every soul deserves someone willing to speak for them. I only did what any decent man would have done in my place." "Not every man would have done it," Jane said. "Not the way you did. Not riding out in a storm, not standing before Holly's Dunbar and the whole county without a second's hesitation. You did more than speak for me, Raymond Wilcox. You saved my whole life." He looked down at her then, and something passed between them that was no longer merely gratitude on her part or duty on his, something warmer and more dangerous and infinitely more welcome. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, standing there in the dusty light of the land office while Prout shuffled his papers and Silas Amos discreetly examined the ceiling and Sheriff Pratt allowed himself a small, satisfied smile beneath his walrus mustache. "Might I call on you, Mrs. Conley?" Raymond asked at last, his voice low and careful, as though he feared the question itself might frighten away whatever fragile thing had begun to grow between them. "Properly, I mean. Not on account of Dunbar or land patents or any of that business. Just to call on you, if you'd allow it." Jane felt heat rise in her cheeks, felt a lightness in her chest she had not known since long before Thomas's death, since perhaps before Thomas at all, since the innocent days of her girlhood in Missouri when the whole world had still seemed full of unbroken promise. "I would allow it gladly, Mr. Wilcox," she said, and the smile that broke across her face was the first true, unguarded smile Raymond had seen from her, and he found himself thinking that he would ride through 100 storms to see it again. The weeks that followed passed for Jane like a slow thaw after a long, hard winter. Raymond came calling twice a week, sometimes bringing small gifts, a jar of honey from his own hives, a length of blue ribbon he'd found at the mercantile that he thought would suit her eyes, a book of poems he'd ordered special from a catalog because she had once mentioned, almost in passing, that she missed the reading she used to do back in Missouri before the demands of the homestead had swallowed every spare hour of her days. He helped her rebuild the barn, working alongside a crew of men from town who came out on a Saturday, at Sheriff Pratt's quiet suggestion, to raise a new frame in a single long day of hammering and laughing and passing around jugs of cool well water. And by sundown the new barn stood taller and sturdier than the old one, and Jane wept again, though this time from an entirely different kind of feeling, watching her neighbors. People she had barely known before that terrible night of the fire clap Raymond on the back, and tipped their hats to her with genuine warmth. "Seems this country gives back after all," she said to him quietly, as the last of the wagons rolled away into the dusk, and the two of them stood together admiring the new barn's raw pine timbers, still pale and unweathered in the fading light. "Told you it would," Raymond said, "if a body's patient enough." There was a barn dance in Prairie Bend that August, held in the loft of the Hendricks family's new hay barn, with 2 fiddlers and a man who played the concertina and long tables set up outside groaning under the weight of fried chicken, and berry pies and pitchers of lemonade sweetened with precious sugar. Raymond arrived at Jane's homestead that evening in a clean white shirt, his boots polished, his hat brushed free of dust, and when Jane came to the door wearing a dress of pale yellow calico she had sewn herself from fabric bought with her first season's corn money, he simply stood there for a long moment, hat in hand, unable to find any words at all. "Well," Jane said, laughing softly at his silence, "you look as though you've seen a ghost, Mr. Wilcox." "No, ma'am," Raymond said, finding his voice at last. "I've seen the prettiest woman in Ford County, and it struck the words clean out of my head." They danced that night beneath lantern light, the fiddles sawing out reels and waltzes while the whole town spun and laughed around them, and Jane found herself, somewhere in the middle of a slow waltz, resting her head against Raymond's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, feeling for the first time in longer than she could remember that she was not merely surviving but genuinely, fully alive. "Jane," Raymond said, his voice low against her ear as they turned slowly beneath the lanterns, the other dancers a blur of color and laughter around them. I know it's not been but a few months since the land office, and I know your grief for Thomas is still fresh, and I won't press you for anything you're not ready to give. But I want you to know that these weeks with you have been the finest of my life since I lost Sarah. I don't say that lightly." "I know it isn't lightly," Jane said, lifting her head to look at him, and in the lantern light his gray-green eyes seemed almost luminous, full of a tenderness that made her chest ache with something sweet and frightening all at once. "And I want you to know, Raymond, that I have stopped counting the months since Thomas died and started counting the days since you walked into that land office and said you'd speak for me. That count feels a good deal shorter and a good deal happier." He stopped dancing then, right there in the middle of the barn floor, though the fiddles played on around them, and he took both her hands in his rough, calloused hands, holding her smaller ones with a gentleness that belied their strength. "Then might I ask you something, Jane Conley? Not tonight, not this very moment, for I know that would be too sudden and you deserve courting proper, the way a woman like you ought to be courted. But might I ask you to consider, someday soon, that you and I could build something together? Not just a friendship, though I'll treasure that regardless of what you answer. I mean a life, Jane, a whole life shared." Jane felt tears rising, though these were nothing like the tears she had wept over Thomas's grave or her burning barn. These were tears of a heart cracking open to let something new and wondrous inside. "I would consider it gladly, Raymond," she said. "In fact, I don't believe I need much more time to consider it at all." He laughed then, a warm, surprised sound, and swept her up into his arms right there on the dance floor, spinning her once before setting her gently back on her feet, both of them laughing now, drawing curious and delighted glances from the other dancers, and Silas Amos, watching from near the punch table, elbowed Sheriff Pratt and said something that made the lawman chuckle into his mustache. Autumn came to the prairie with its long golden light and its cool, clean mornings, and Raymond Wilcox and Jane Conley courted properly through the harvest season, riding together to check on cattle, sharing Sunday dinners after church, sitting together on Jane's porch in the evenings while the crickets sang, and the stars wheeled slow and bright overhead. He told her more of Sarah, of his childhood in Missouri, of the long cattle drives he had once ridden down to Abilene before he'd settled his own spread. She told him more of Thomas, of her parents, of the brother she still sometimes dreamed about, young and laughing, before the war had taken him from her forever. They shared their griefs as freely as they shared their hopes, and in the sharing, both found that the weight of old sorrow grew lighter, easier to carry when carried together. Holly's Dunbar did not trouble Jane again that autumn, though word came through town that his cattle operation had run into difficulties of its own, a bad season, a drop in beef prices, a rumor of debts owed to the bank in Wichita that he could not easily cover, and though Jane felt no particular satisfaction in another's misfortune, she could not deny a certain quiet relief in knowing that his attention and his malice had turned elsewhere. It was in October, beneath the very cottonwood trees that Thomas had planted 5 years before, now grown tall and rustling gold with autumn leaves, that Raymond Wilcox finally asked Jane Conley to marry him. He had ridden out that evening with a small velvet box tucked into his coat pocket, a ring he had ordered from a jeweler in Wichita, simple gold with a small clear stone that had cost him nearly a full season's profit from his cattle, though he would have paid twice as much and thought it a bargain. He found Jane in her garden, gathering the last of the season's squash before the first frost could claim them, her hair coming loose from its pins, dirt on her hands and a smudge of it on her cheek, and he thought, watching her, that he had never in his life seen a woman so beautiful. "Jane," he said, and something in his voice made her look up immediately, made her set down the squash she was holding and straighten to face him fully. "Raymond, what is it? You look as though you've something important to say." "I do," he said, and he found, despite all his careful planning, that his voice shook slightly as he spoke. "Jane Conley, I have loved you since before I rightly understood what was happening to me, Since that first evening I rode beside your wagon and heard you laugh at some foolish thing I said about Thomas's exaggerations. I have watched you rebuild your life from ashes and grief with a strength I have never seen equaled in any man or woman. I have no family left either, not really, not since I lost my folks and Sarah both in that same terrible winter. But I hope, that you and I might be family to each other now if you'll have me." He knelt then, right there in the garden dirt, heedless of his good trousers, and opened the small velvet box with hands that trembled despite their strength. "Jane Conley, will you marry me?" Jane looked down at him, at this man who had stood up in a crowded land office for a stranger simply because it was right, who had ridden through a lightning storm because some instinct told him she needed him, who had spent 6 months proving through every small and steady action that his character was every bit as fine as his first words had promised, and she felt her heart, which she had thought permanently guarded against such joy, open wide and unguarded at last. "Yes," she said, and then, laughing through sudden tears, "yes, Raymond, 1,000 times yes. I would be honored to be your family and to have you be mine." He rose and took her in his arms then, and beneath the rustling gold cottonwoods that Thomas Conley had planted 5 years before, Raymond Wilcox kissed Jane Conley for the first time, a slow and tender kiss that tasted of autumn air and unspoken promises. And somewhere behind them, a meadowlark called out across the darkening fields, as though the whole prairie itself were singing its approval. They were married the following month, on a crisp November morning, in the small white church at the edge of Prairie Bend, with the whole town turned out to witness it. Silas Amos gave the bride away, since she had no father to do it, walking her down the short aisle with tears standing openly in his old eyes, and Sheriff Amos Pratt stood as Raymond's best man, and the whole congregation sang the old hymns with a fervor that seemed to Jane like the whole town's collective relief, and joy pouring out at once. Relief that this good woman who had suffered so much had finally found her happiness. Joy that Raymond Wilcox, a man many of them had quietly worried might spend the rest of his days alone with his grief, had found someone to share his life with at last. Jane wore a dress of soft cream muslin that the women of the town had helped her sew, gathered together over 3 evenings of quilting and laughter and shared stories. And when she walked down that aisle and saw Raymond waiting for her at the altar, dressed in a new dark suit, his hat in his hands, his eyes bright with unashamed tears, she thought her heart might simply burst from the fullness of it. "Do you, Raymond Wilcox, take this woman, Jane Conley, to be your lawful wife?" "I do," Raymond said, his voice clear and unwavering, "and I promise before God and this whole town that I will speak for her and stand beside her and love her, for every day the good Lord grants us." "Do you, Jane Conley, take this man, Raymond Wilcox, to be your lawful husband?" "I do," Jane said, and found that despite the tears streaming freely down her face, her voice did not falter at all. "I promise to be his family as he has promised to be mine, and to love him faithfully all the days of my life." When the preacher pronounced them man and wife and Raymond kissed his bride before the whole assembled congregation, the church erupted into cheers and applause that Jane felt certain must have carried clear across the prairie. And outside, as they emerged into the cold, bright November sunlight, someone fired a rifle into the air in celebration. And the whole town gathered around them with rice and well wishes, and a wagon decorated with ribbons to carry them out to the small celebration feast that had been prepared at the Hendricks barn. Life on the combined ranches, for Raymond had insisted they keep both spreads, running his cattle and Jane's homestead together, as one larger operation settled into a rhythm of hard work and deep contentment that Jane had scarcely dared to hope for in the dark months after Thomas's death. They rebuilt the sod house into a proper timber-framed home the following spring, with real glass windows that caught the morning light and a wide porch where they took their coffee together every dawn before the day's work began. They ran cattle and grew corn and wheat, and Raymond taught Jane to rope, and she taught him some of the finer points of dairy farming that Thomas had once shown her. And between the two of them, the ranch prospered in a way that made even Holly's Dunbar, who eventually sold off most of his holdings and left the county entirely after his debts finally caught up with him, seem like a distant and almost forgettable storm that had passed through their lives and moved on. In the autumn of 1879, nearly a year after their wedding, Jane discovered she was carrying a child, and when she told Raymond the news one evening on their porch, watching the sun sink low and gold over their fields, he wept openly, unashamed, and pressed his forehead to hers, and thanked God in a voice thick with emotion for every single turn of fate that had brought them to this moment together. Their first child, a son they named Thomas Raymond Wilcox in honor of both the husband Jane had lost and the man who had become his true successor, was born in the early summer of 1880, a healthy, loud, red-faced boy who took immediately to his father's arms and seemed, from his very first hours, entirely unafraid of the wide world into which he'd been born. 2 years later came a daughter, whom they named Sarah Jane in honor of Raymond's first wife, a gesture that moved Raymond so deeply he could not speak for several minutes after Jane suggested it. And 3 years after that, a second son, William, round-faced and easy-tempered, who grew up chasing his older brother and sister across the same fields their mother had once broken alone with a borrowed plow and a grief too large to carry by herself. Jane Conley Wilcox often thought, in the quiet moments of her busy and abundant life, of that day in the land office when she had stood alone with no family left to speak for her, and she thought of how one man's simple decision to step forward, to say 3 plain words, "I'll speak for her," had unraveled every thread of loneliness that had bound her since the deaths of her parents, her brother and her first husband, and had woven in its place a whole new tapestry of family, of belonging, of love so deep and so certain that she sometimes woke in the night simply to listen to Raymond's steady breathing beside her and marvel at the strange and generous mercy of it. She thought, too, of Thomas, and knew, with the particular clarity that sometimes comes to those who have loved and loved again, that he would have been glad of it, glad that the land he had labored over had been protected, glad that his widow had found a good man to share her life, glad, perhaps most of all, that his own name lived on in the sturdy, laughing form of their eldest son, who even at 4 years old had inherited his mother's fierce dark eyes, and, if the neighbors were to be believed, a stubborn streak that could only have come from his mother's side of the family. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Raymond took Jane out to the old cottonwood trees that Thomas had planted, now grown tall and broad enough to shade the whole eastern side of the yard, and he presented her with a small carved wooden box he had made himself in the evenings after the children had gone to bed. Inside it lay a collection of small mementos, a pressed flower from their wedding day, a lock of baby hair from each of their 3 children, and a small folded piece of paper that, when Jane opened it, proved to be a copy of the very land patent that had once been so nearly stolen from her, the document that had made this whole life, this whole abundant family, possible. "I wanted you to have something to remember it by," Raymond said, his voice rough with feeling as she looked up at him with tears standing bright in her eyes. Not the fear of it, not Dunbar or the fire or any of the hard parts. Just the reminder that even on the darkest days, when it seems like there's no one left in the whole world to stand up for us, sometimes all it takes is one person willing to step forward and say the words that change everything. "You changed everything, Raymond Wilcox," Jane said, reaching up to touch his weathered cheek with a hand that had grown strong and capable through years of shared labor, shared joy, shared sorrow weathered together rather than alone. "You gave me back a family when I thought I'd lost every last piece of one. I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for it and loving you for it, and I would not trade a single hard day of these past 5 years, because every one of them led me here, to you, to our children, to this life we've built together out of nothing but sod and stubbornness and love." He kissed her then, beneath the rustling cottonwood leaves, with the golden light of another prairie evening falling soft and warm around them. And from the house behind them came the sound of their children's laughter, 3 young voices rising bright and unafraid into the wide Kansas sky, a sound that Jane Conley Wilcox had once feared she would never hear in her own home. A sound that now filled every corner of her heart with a happiness so complete she sometimes had to stop in the middle of an ordinary afternoon and simply marvel at how far she had come, from a woman with no family left to speak for her, to the beloved center of a family so full and so strong that no storm, no fire, no cruel and covetous man could ever again threaten to take it from her. The years continued to unfold gently after that, each season bringing its own small joys and its own hard-won lessons, the way seasons always do on the prairie. Raymond expanded the cattle operation twice more, buying up 2 adjoining sections when a neighboring family moved on to try their luck farther west. And by the time their eldest son Thomas turned 10, the Wilcox Ranch was counted among the finest and most respected operations in Ford County, known not merely for the quality of its cattle, but for the fairness with which Raymond dealt with every hand he hired and every neighbor he traded with, a reputation he had built deliberately. Remembering always the day a corrupt land agent and a greedy cattle baron had nearly stolen a good woman's whole future through nothing but legal trickery and cruelty. Jane, for her part, became something of a fixture in Prairie Bend's small community, known for her skill with a rifle, which she taught to her own children and to several of the neighboring girls who came asking, insisting that no woman on the prairie ought to go without knowing how to defend herself and what was hers. She helped organize the town's first proper schoolhouse in 1883, arguing passionately before the town council that children out on the scattered homesteads deserved an education every bit as thorough as those in the larger towns back east. And when the schoolhouse finally opened its doors, her own children were among the first to walk through them, along with a dozen others from the surrounding ranches and farms. Silas Amos lived long enough to see all 3 of the Wilcox children grow into their school years, and he became something of a beloved grandfather figure to them, teaching young Thomas to fish in the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, and telling Sarah Jane long, rambling stories about the early days of the territory that made her eyes go wide with wonder. When he passed peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1885, at the age of 71, the whole Wilcox family mourned him as they might have mourned true kin, and Raymond spoke at his funeral, reminding the gathered mourners that Silas Amos had been among the first to stand up for Jane when she had needed it most, a debt of gratitude that no number of years could ever fully repay. Sheriff Amos Pratt served Ford County faithfully for another decade before retiring to a small property just outside town, where he took up beekeeping with an enthusiasm that amused his old friends and provided the Wilcox family with a steady supply of excellent honey every summer. He remained close to Raymond and Jane throughout, a frequent guest at their table, and he liked to tell the story, whenever new folks came to town, of the day a young cowboy had stood up in a crowded land office and changed the whole course of a young widow's life with 3 simple words. As for Hollis Dunbar, he faded from the county's memory almost entirely within a few years, his debts finally forcing the sale of his remaining land holdings to pay off creditors in Wichita, and he was said to have moved on to try his fortunes in the mining camps of Colorado, where, by all accounts, luck continued to elude him as thoroughly as it had in Kansas. Jane thought of him rarely, and when she did, it was without bitterness, only a distant and somewhat wondering gratitude that his cruelty, however painful at the time, had ultimately served only to bring her and Raymond together all the sooner. In the spring of 1888, 10 years almost to the day since Jane Conley had stood alone in that Prairie Bend land office and declared that she had no family left to speak for her, the whole extended Wilcox clan gathered beneath the old cottonwood trees to celebrate not only Raymond and Jane's 10th wedding anniversary, but also the confirmation of their eldest son Thomas, now nearly 8 years old and already showing every sign of growing into the same steady, principled character that had first drawn his mother to his father's namesake all those years before. Jane stood on the porch of the home she and Raymond had built together, watching her 3 children run laughing through the tall June grass, watching Raymond, gray now beginning to touch his temples, but no less broad-shouldered and steady than the day she had first seen him step forward in that crowded land office, laughing with Sheriff Pratt over some old story from their shared past, and she felt a peace so deep and so complete that it seemed to settle into her very bones. A peace that no amount of hardship or grief in her earlier years could diminish, because it had been earned, hard-won, built patiently season after season out of love freely given and freely returned. 10 years, Raymond said, coming to stand beside her on the porch, slipping his arm around her waist in the easy, familiar way of long married love. 10 years since I saw the finest woman in Ford County standing up to Holly's Dunbar with nothing but her own courage to protect her. You gave me more than courage that day, Jane said, leaning her head against his shoulder as the late afternoon sun gilded the fields before them, fields that had once been broken by grief and were now, season after abundant season, harvested in joy. You gave me a voice when I thought I had none left. You gave me a family when I believed I had none remaining in this whole wide world. You had more courage in you than any 10 men I've known, Raymond said softly, pressing a kiss to the crown of her head. I only reminded you of it and stood beside you while you found it again. Below them, in the golden fields, their children's laughter rang out clear and bright across the prairie. 3 young voices that carried within them the blended legacies of Thomas Conley's quiet devotion, of Raymond Wilcox's steadfast honor, and of Jane Conley Wilcox's unbreakable, hard-won strength. And as the sun continued its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the whole wide Kansas sky in shades of rose and gold, Jane Conley Wilcox knew, with a certainty as deep and as settled as the earth beneath her feet, that she had found, at long last, everything she had once feared she would never have again. A family, whole and complete, to speak for her, to stand beside her, and to love her for every remaining day of her life, exactly as Raymond had promised her, all those years ago, in a crowded land office on a spring afternoon that had changed the entire course of both their lives forever. And so it was that in the small, unassuming town of Prairie Bend, Kansas, in the closing decades of the 19th century, a widow with no family left to speak for her found, through the simple, stubborn kindness of one honest cowboy, not merely the preservation of 160 acres of hard-won prairie sod, but an entire lifetime of love, of laughter, of children's voices ringing bright across golden fields, and of a partnership so deeply rooted in mutual respect and abiding affection that neither time, nor hardship, nor the passing of the frontier itself into memory could ever diminish what Jane Conley and Raymond Wilcox had built together, side by side, for the whole of their long and abundant days.